My neighbor didn't knock. She rang the doorbell twice, fast, the way people do when they're nervous about bothering you, but can't stop themselves. I was in the kitchen, pouring my second cup of coffee, still in my robe at 9 in the morning because that's one of the few privileges of being 64 and retired. I opened the door, and there she was. Audrey Simmons from next door, 70-something. White hair, pulled back neat, holding a casserole dish she clearly hadn't planned to bring over. I think she grabbed it off her counter just to have something to do with her hands. "I'm sorry to bother you, Walt," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "You're not bothering me at all. Come in." She shook her head. "I just wanted to tell you something. I've been going back and forth about it for 2 weeks, and I decided you'd want to know." She paused. "There has been a light on in your garage. Late at night. Not every night, but most nights. Around 2:30. I looked at her. "I sleep poorly," she said, a little apologetically. "I see the light from my bedroom window when I get up for water. It goes off around 3:30. I told her I appreciated her telling me. I told her it was probably nothing, maybe a wiring thing. Maybe I'd left something plugged in. I smiled the whole time she was standing on my porch. I kept smiling until I closed the door. Then I stood in my hallway for a long time. My garage had been locked since January. I hadn't opened it myself in 4 months. My wife Dorothy passed 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, which is its own kind of violence. The kind that doesn't give you time to breathe, let alone grieve. She was 61. We had been married 38 years. After she was gone, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd spent 4 decades building a life around another person, and then suddenly, the architecture of every single day just collapsed. I started going to bed at 7:30. I stopped cooking real meals. My son, Elliot, called once a week, always on Sunday, always exactly 12 minutes. My daughter Tessa called more often, but her calls had a shape to them, a careful, orbiting quality, like she was checking on an investment. I don't know exactly when I started noticing it. The way Tessa's questions had shifted. Less about how I was doing, more about the house. Whether I'd thought about downsizing. Whether the property taxes were getting to be too much. Whether I'd updated my will since Dorothy. I had a neighbor in Kingsport, Tennessee for 32 years. We bought that house in 1991 when Elliot was 4 and Tessa was 2. 3 bedrooms, detached garage, half an acre, mature oak trees in the backyard. Dorothy planted a rose garden along the fence line and tended it every spring without fail. The house appraised at $430,000 last year. I hadn't updated my will. Dorothy and I had one together, drafted in 2008. Equal split between Elliot and Tessa, with a $20,000 bequest to the Smoky Mountain Children's Shelter, a place Dorothy had volunteered at for 15 years. It wasn't a complicated document. A house, some savings, her jewelry, my tools. After Dorothy died, I went to see our attorney, a man named Prentice, who'd handled our affairs for years, and he told me I should update everything now that I was the sole signatory. I said I would. I didn't. I kept putting it off the way you put off things that make death feel real. I told Tessa I hadn't updated it yet during one of her calls. I don't know why I told her. It slipped out in the way things slip out when you're lonely and talking to your child and you just want to fill the silence with something real. That was 8 months ago. I went out to the garage that afternoon after Audrey left. Everything looked fine. Padlock on the door, same as always. I opened it and stood in the threshold. The smell of motor oil and sawdust and decades of accumulated life. Dorothy's gardening tools were in the back corner. Her wheelbarrow, her kneeling pad, her collection of clay pots she'd never gotten around to using. I hadn't touched any of it. I told myself I was preserving it. Mostly, I just couldn't. Along the back wall, I had a workbench with 2 large built-in cabinets underneath. I'd built them myself in 2003. One held power tools. The other held files. Paper files. Old ones. Mortgage documents. Car titles. Insurance policies going back 20 years. and in a red accordion folder tucked behind a box of drill bits. The original executed copy of mine and Dorothy's 2008 will. I knew it was there. I'd forgotten anyone else might know that too. I opened the cabinet. The red folder was still there. I pulled it out and unfolded it on the workbench. The will was inside, exactly as I'd left it. But something was off. I've been methodical my whole life. It comes from 30 years as a civil engineer. You learn to keep records a certain way. Always. The will had been paperclipped to a cover sheet with a yellow sticky note in my own handwriting listing the date I'd filed it and Prentice's phone number. The paperclip was on the wrong side. The sticky note was gone. I stood there in the afternoon light with the document in my hands, and the back of my neck went cold. I didn't say anything to Tessa. I didn't say anything to Elliot either. I went inside, sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours, and thought very carefully about what I knew and what I didn't. What I knew, someone had been in my locked garage late at night. Someone had opened the cabinet. Someone had handled the will. What I didn't know, why. I called my friend Ray Dunbar that evening. Ray is a retired sheriff's deputy, 68 years old, knows everyone in our county and half the state. I didn't tell him everything. I just asked him casually whether he knew anything about how wills could be contested or altered after someone dies. He gave me a look over the phone. You can hear a look sometimes. Why are you asking me that, Walt? Just thinking about estate stuff, I said. Getting my affairs in order. He let it go. But then he said, you know, the tricky part with a handwritten change is the date. You'd need witnesses or a notary, or both, depending on the state. But if someone just wanted to swap pages in an existing document and the original wasn't easily accessible to compare against, that could cause a real problem for whoever was contesting it. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in the dark for a while. Then I called my son-in-law. Tessa had been married to a man named Drew for 11 years. Drew was pleasant, forgettable, the kind of man who always remembered to bring a bottle of wine to dinner and never remembered anyone's birthday. He worked in insurance. He knew things about documents. I didn't call to ask him anything. I called to listen. Hey, Walt, he said, surprised. Everything okay? Just checking in, I said. Haven't talked to you in a bit. How are things? There was a pause. Just a half-second pause, but it was there. Good, good. Things are good. Tessa's actually out with her friend Lorraine tonight. That's fine. I'll catch her another time. How's work been? We talked for 15 minutes about nothing. His voice was easy and relaxed, but twice he asked, in 2 different ways, whether I'd had a chance to see my attorney lately. I bought 2 cameras the next morning. Small, wireless, the kind that look like smoke detectors. I watched 3 YouTube videos on installation before I left the store parking lot, sitting in my truck with my reading glasses on, feeling slightly ridiculous. I was a civil engineer for 30 years. I designed drainage systems for interstate highways. I could handle a wireless camera. I installed one inside the garage, mounted up in the corner behind a metal shelving unit, angled toward the workbench. I installed the other one on the back porch, covering the side gate that led to the garage. I linked them both to an app on my phone. Tested them. Got clear footage. Then I drove to my neighbor on the other side, a quiet man named Frank, retired school teacher, very private, very trustworthy, and I asked if I could park my truck in his driveway for a few nights without explanation. Frank looked at me for a moment and said, "Of course, Walt." He didn't ask why. I've always liked Frank. I started leaving my porch light off at 10 o'clock and going to bed. Except I wasn't in my bed. I was sitting in my armchair in the dark living room with my phone in my hand, watching the camera feeds. First night, nothing. Second night, nothing. I fell asleep in the chair both times and woke up with a sore neck. Third night at 2:17 in the morning, I watched a figure come through my side gate. I knew the walk immediately. You know your children's walks the way you know their voices. Something that lives in your body before your brain catches up. The slight forward lean, the particular rhythm of the stride. It was Tessa. She was wearing dark clothes and carrying a small bag. She had her own key to the padlock. I hadn't known that. I watched her open the garage on the camera feed with hands that worked the lock like she'd done it before, which I realized she probably had, multiple times over the past 2 weeks while I was asleep in my house 10 feet away. She went straight to the workbench, opened the right cabinet without hesitating, pulled out the red accordion folder. I watched her take the will out and set it on the workbench under the work light. She opened the bag. I couldn't see everything clearly, but I could see her lean over the document for a long time. She took photographs of each page with her phone. Then she put it all back, exactly as she found it. Almost exactly. Closed the cabinet, turned off the light, and left. I sat in the dark and did not move for a long time. My daughter, my 54-year-old daughter with 2 kids of her own, who I had loved and worried over, and driven to dance recitals and college orientation and held at her mother's graveside. She had come into my garage in the middle of the night to photograph my will. I thought about calling Ray. I thought about calling Prentice. Instead, I opened the camera app and saved the footage to the cloud backup. Then I did it twice more from different devices. Then I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I sat at my kitchen table and waited for morning. I didn't call Tessa. I didn't change the padlock, didn't move the will, didn't do anything that would tell her I knew. I'd spent 30 years on job sites where you never showed your hand before the concrete was poured. You wait until everything is in place. What I did was call Prentice. I went into his office on a Tuesday morning and I sat across from his desk and I told him I wanted to update my will. I told him I wanted to add a significant bequest to the Dorothy Callahan Memorial Fund, a small fund I'd started through our church after Dorothy died to help families in the congregation going through medical hardship. I told him I wanted the house, in the event of my death, to be held in trust for 2 years before any sale, with the proceeds split 4 ways: Elliot, Tessa, the Smoky Mountain Children's Shelter, and the Memorial Fund. Prentice looked at me over his reading glasses. That's a meaningful change, Walt. Any particular reason for the timing? I should have done it sooner, I said. Dorothy would have wanted the fund included. That part was true. The rest of the reasoning I kept to myself. Prentice drafted the new document. I signed it that same week with 2 witnesses. He kept the original in his office safe. I took a copy home and put it in my fireproof lockbox in the bedroom closet behind my winter coats. Then I had a copy made of the 2008 will and put that in the garage cabinet, in the red accordion folder, exactly where it had always been. 3 weeks went by. Tessa called on a Wednesday. Her usual warmth, her usual careful questions woven in between the normal conversation. I told her I still hadn't gotten around to seeing Prentice. She said, "Dad, you really should." Her voice had that quality, gentle, slightly exasperated, the tone of someone managing a situation. "You're right," I said. "I'll get to it." I slept poorly that night. Not from worry, from something sadder than worry. The specific grief of understanding someone you love and not liking what you understand. A week after that, Prentice called me. Someone had contacted his office asking to speak with him about my estate. They hadn't identified themselves as family at first. They'd called claiming to be a representative, asking general questions about Tennessee probate law, about what happens when an original will can't be located, about whether a photograph copy carries legal weight. Prentice, who has been practicing estate law for 40 years, told me he'd ended the call and contacted me immediately. "Do you know who this was, Walt?" "I have a good idea," I said. "Do you want to tell me?" "Not yet," I said, "but I want you to document that call. Date, time, content, everything." He was quiet for a moment. "Walt, is there something I should know?" "There will be," I said. "Give me a little more time." I talked to Ray that weekend, told him everything. Ray listened without interrupting, which is not his natural state, so I knew he was taking it seriously. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have the camera footage," he said. 3 weeks of it. "You have the original call log Prentice is documenting." "Yes, and you've already changed the will with proper witnesses. Signed and filed." Ray let out a long breath. "Walt, I want you to understand something. What she did, going into your property, photographing legal documents, potentially planning to present a fraudulent version in a probate proceeding. That's not just a civil matter. That could rise to criminal fraud, forgery, conspiracy, depending on whether Drew was involved. I've been thinking about Drew. The two calls where he'd asked about my attorney, the half-second pause when I'd called him unannounced. I think he knew, I said. Then you need to decide what you want to do about that. I thought about it for a long time after we hung up. What do you do when the person who has done this to you is your child, when you can see them at 7 years old in your memory, running through the sprinkler in the backyard, and at the same time understand clearly what they tried to do to you? You don't pretend it didn't happen. I'd learned that much from 38 years of marriage and 38 of marriage and 30 years of engineering. A crack in the foundation doesn't seal itself. You document it, you address it, and then you build something that will hold. I called Tessa on a Sunday. I asked if she and Drew could come for dinner the following Saturday. She said yes immediately. Too quickly, the way people say yes when they've been waiting to be invited. I cooked a pot roast because that was Dorothy's recipe, and I wanted to feel her presence in the room. They arrived at 6. Drew brought wine. Of course he did. Tessa hugged me at the door and held on a second longer than usual. Maybe guilt. Maybe something else. I showed them into the dining room and we sat down and I poured the wine and we talked about their kids. My grandchildren, Bryce and Hannah, who I love fiercely and think about separately from all of this. And for a while it was just dinner. After the plates were cleared, Drew said almost too casually, "Dad, have you thought any more about your affairs? The will situation?" I looked at him. I looked at Tessa. She was looking at her wine glass. "Actually," I said, "I went to see Prentice." The silence that came into that room was a particular kind of silence. The kind that has shape and weight. "I updated everything," I said. "It's filed, signed, witnessed. The house goes into trust before any sale, and there are 4 beneficiaries now instead of 2. Prentice has the original in his safe." Tessa looked up. Her face did something complicated. "I watched it happen. I also," I said, "want you to know that I'm aware someone has been accessing my garage at night. I know about the calls to Prentice's office, and I have documentation of both." Drew set his glass down. "I'm not calling the police tonight," I said. "That decision is still in front of me, but I want you both to understand that I know, and that what you did, what was being planned, it's not something I can unknow. And it's not something that will quietly go away." No one spoke for what felt like a long time. Tessa said, "Dad, not tonight," I said. "I don't want explanations tonight. I want you both to go home and think carefully about what comes next. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I have already protected myself. The will is done. The evidence is preserved. What happens next is up to you." They left at 7:30. Drew's wine sat on the table, still mostly full. I called Elliot the next morning. Not the Sunday call, not the 12-minute check-in. I called on a Monday, first thing, and I talked for an hour. I told him most of it. His reaction was anger and then hurt, and then a silence that had its own kind of grief in it. He drove down from Nashville 2 weekends later, and we sat on the back porch together for most of a Saturday, not always talking. Elliot said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to Ray again this week," I said. "There are a few different paths. I haven't decided." "Are you okay?" I thought about that honestly for a moment. "I'm not entirely okay," I said, "but I'm clearer than I've been in a while." That spring, I started working in the garage again. Real work. Fixing an old Adirondack chair that had been sitting broken in the corner since the summer before Dorothy died. I replaced 2 of the arm slats and resanded the whole thing and painted it the same dark green she'd always liked. I put it in the backyard near the rose garden. Audrey came over one afternoon while I was out there. She looked at the chair and at the roses, which had come back on their own this year. I hadn't touched them, hadn't needed to. Dorothy had planted them well enough that they just kept coming back regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. "That's a beautiful chair," Audrey said. "It was always hers," I said. "I just finally fixed it." She nodded, the way people nod when they understand something larger is being said. I talked to Prentice twice more since that dinner. The decision I'd arrived at, after long conversations with Ray and Prentice and a quiet evening on my own porch working through it, was a civil approach. First, a formal legal notice through Prentice to Tessa and Drew, documenting the attempted interference with my estate and making clear that the evidence was preserved and on record, and that any future action would result in immediate referral to law enforcement. It wasn't mercy exactly. It was precision. I knew what I had. I didn't need to burn everything down to prove it. Drew called Prentice directly the week after the notice was received. That conversation I don't have the details of, but Prentice told me Drew was cooperative and acknowledged the calls to the office had been a mistake. I heard later through Elliot that things between Tessa and Drew had gotten difficult, which I had no satisfaction in hearing, and which I also couldn't feel responsible for. Tessa called me 6 weeks after that dinner. It was a Thursday, not her usual time. She didn't call to explain or defend. She called to say she was sorry. She cried, which she rarely did. And I listened, and I said the things a father says. The true ones. That I loved her. That I didn't hate her. That I didn't understand how we'd gotten here. I didn't say everything was fine. I didn't say everything was fine. I didn't say it wasn't. Some distances, once created, close slowly. Some don't fully close. I stopped expecting a resolution that looks the way reconciliation is supposed to look in the movies. What I have is the actual thing. Complicated, unfinished, ongoing, which I suspect is more honest than the clean version would have been. I go out to that chair in the backyard most evenings now, if the weather allows. There's something about sitting in a thing you repaired yourself, in a garden that kept growing without being asked to. Dorothy planted those roses in 1997. They've survived 30 Tennessee winters, 2 droughts, and everything else. They don't need me to tell them what to do. I think about the night I sat in the dark in my living room, watching a camera feed I'd installed in my own garage, watching my daughter's hands move over a document she had no business touching. I think about how that moment split something, the way a fault line doesn't show on the surface until the pressure gets high enough. I also think about the things I did right. I didn't panic. I didn't confront before I was ready. I documented, I waited, I moved carefully, everything I'd spent 30 years learning to do before that skill was ever needed in a place this personal. And I updated the will. Dorothy's fund is in there now, the way it should have been from the beginning. Every spring, the interest from the memorial account helps 2 or 3 families in our congregation through something unbearable. Her name is on the letterhead. It will be there after I'm gone. I sit in the green chair in the evening and look at the roses and drink my coffee and think about what she would say about all of this. She was practical Dorothy, clear-eyed in the way that people who have genuinely suffered sometimes become not hard, just honest. She would not be surprised, I think. She had always seen people more clearly than I had. Maybe she'd have seen this coming long before it arrived. I like to think she planted those roses deep enough on purpose, just in case no one was around to tend them. Just in case they had to survive on their own. They do. I've been thinking a lot lately about cause and effect, not in any grand or philosophical way, just the plain, quiet version of it that you learn when you've lived long enough to see how things connect. Every action leaves a mark somewhere. Every choice sends something forward into time, even when you can't see where it's going. Tessa didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone who would go through her father's files in the dark. That's not how people work. It happened in small steps. A conversation here, a calculation there, a slow drift away from the person she was raised to be. I'm not saying that to excuse it. I'm saying it because understanding how something happens is different from forgiving it, and I've had to learn to hold both at the same time. What I did right, and I say this not with pride, but with plain relief, was that I didn't react from fear. I reacted from clarity. There's a difference. Fear makes you move fast and talk loud and do things you can't take back. Clarity makes you sit in a dark living room with a phone in your hand and wait until you actually know what you're dealing with. 30 years of engineering taught me that. You don't redesign the bridge until you understand where the stress is coming from. The intelligence part of this, and I think it matters to say it plainly, wasn't about being smarter than anyone. It was about being patient enough to gather real information before I acted on it. I could have called Tessa the morning after Audrey told me about the lights. I could have accused, confronted, blown everything apart before I had a single piece of documented evidence. I would have looked unstable. I would have handed her an advantage. Instead, I watched, I documented. I changed the will through proper legal channels, and by the time I sat across from her at that dinner table, I had already protected everything that mattered. The moral part is harder to talk about, because it isn't really about Tessa. It's about what I chose to do with what I knew. I had enough to go to law enforcement. I still might. But I also have 2 grandchildren who call me on my birthday and don't know any of this happened. Whatever I decide, I have to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know I acted from principle, not from anger. Dorothy always said that the difference between justice and revenge is what you're trying to build when it's over. She was right about most things. The resilience. That's just getting up in the morning when the chair across the kitchen table is still empty and the person you used to talk all of this through with isn't there. That's the hardest part, and it's also the most ordinary part. You do it because there's no alternative, and after a while the doing of it becomes its own kind of strength. I sit in that green chair in the evenings now and I think about what I want the rest of my life to look like. Not what I'm owed, not what was almost taken, what I want to build. Dorothy's fund is growing. Elliot drove down last month and we fixed the fence together. The roses came back again this spring without being asked to. That's enough. That's more than enough.